All right, so part two of our content this week is the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. As I said, if you've already taken Earth Environmental Science, scientific revolution will basically be a review for you. The Enlightenment will be new information that you have to know for your civics and economics class next year. It's very, very important to get the main people and the main ideas from them. So here we go with the scientific revolution. Hopefully, you already know what the term geocentric means. Geo meaning earth, centric meaning center. So there were obviously scientific thinkers in Europe who came up with their theories of what the universe looked like. I really want to point out to you that when we were together face to face, we talked about this, that the Egyptians knew the sun was the center of the universe. Early Indian civilizations, like India, knew that the sun was the center of the universe. The Mayans knew the sun was the center of the universe. Pretty much the rest of the world was in on the idea that the sun is the center of the universe. And it is really just Europe who is still very backwards on this. But you have a guy named Tomley, who is a scientist who supported the geocentric model of the universe. And this model was supported by the Catholic Church. And you have to excuse my dog whining in the background. The Catholic Church believed that the earth was the center of the universe because of a couple Bible verses that they claimed were proof that the earth was the center of the universe. Obviously, today we don't support this model. We know that this is incorrect. And if I showed you the Bible verses that the Catholic Church was using as their arguments, none of them are at all like a smoking gun that the earth is the center of the universe. But the Catholic Church stood by this model and did not want anyone saying otherwise, because then they were speaking against the Bible, which is heresy, which, if you remember from the Inquisition, is punishable by death, specifically being burned alive. So there's a guy named Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus, who comes up with the heliocentric model of the universe. Now, it's not perfect. The sun is at the center, but it's still not the solar system that you know and love today. So Nicholas Copernicus is the first person to bring this up in Europe to say, hey, we think it's heliocentric. And I want to point out again, many civilizations were already aware of this, but we in Europe at this time were not as smart as the rest of the world, as you remember from the Middle Ages. Okay. So that's the big thing you have to know. Make sure you know the difference between geocentric and heliocentric, which I'm sure you actually already know. That's going to play a role in the most important person, who's Galileo. The third guy you got to know is Johannes Kepler. He's a German mathematician, and he came up with the idea that the Earth orbits the sun in a heliocentric model in an elliptical pattern. It's like an egg shape, not a perfect circle. As you see here, the orbits are all perfect circles, and he came up with the fact that we circle in an ellipse. This is correct. We do circle in an ellipse. It's not a perfect circle, and he's basically kicking off to the point where hopefully we understand the closer you are to the sun doesn't mean that you're warmer. It's the way that the Earth is rotated, whether you're rotated toward turned towards the sun or away from the sun for the equator. Anyway, that's for another time. All right, the last scientist that you have to know about is a guy named Galileo Galilei, and he's the most important. And if we were together face to face, he's the one that we would massively focus on. You know Galileo from inventing the telescope. He used that telescope to study what was in space: stars, planets, comets, all of these things. And he published that he believed planets were not heavenly bodies and were not orbs of light, that they were things like Earth. They were these substances that had matter on them. And he supported Copernicus's heliocentric model of the universe. And he published a lot of books on the subject. And thanks to the printing press, there were multiple copies of these books and people could read them, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem is, when he starts publishing, the Pope at the time was actually very forgiving and allowed Galileo to publish these works in Italy, basically saying, as long as you don't directly state that the Catholic Church is wrong, then you can publish this work. Well, that pope dies and another pope takes over. And when the new pope takes over, he does not take kindly at all to what Galileo is doing and finds it all as heresy. So he is put on trial and arrested for writing things about the heliocentric model of the universe and saying that the stars and the planets that we see in the night sky was not heaven, that it was some kind of matter up there in outer space, because the Catholic Church was also saying that the stars were heaven. So the Catholic Church charges them with heresy, puts him on trial, and at the result of the trial, he is actually given life in prison. But because of his old age and ill health, he's given house arrest until he dies. Now, this is in 1633 that the punishment is handed down. His trial goes on for several years, but when it culminates and it ends, it's 1633. In 1992, the Catholic Church formally apologizes for what they did to Galileo. Just to give you a little idea, I was alive in 1992. I was in elementary school in 1992. I know you think the 90s are a long, long time ago, but they're really not. So for the Catholic Church to formally apologize in 1992 is just quite comical, because you should have apologized a long time ago for what happened to Galileo. Clearly, he's not able to continue his work at the level that he should have been able to, and he's on house arrest, I think, for like 8 years before he dies, and is totally blind when he dies, and a lot of other sad things that happened to him because of his health. So Galileo's story is not a happy one. It's one of those where religion and science clashed, and unfortunately, religion won out on that battle where it should not have. So there's a famous image, a painting of Galileo. There he is on trial by the Inquisition. You can always pick out the Catholic cardinals because they're wearing that red and white. And then there's a little funny cartoon. Maybe you can figure out why that's funny. Using his telescope, talking about it. The guy from the church is hitting him on the head with it. And that's the year 1610. Okay? All right, so we have to talk about our Enlightenment thinkers now. Yes! There's my child. We have to talk about our Enlightenment thinkers and our big ones and what the Enlightenment is. Okay, so the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment go hand in hand. The Scientific Revolution is about heliocentric versus geocentric. The Enlightenment is a time period that is about getting rid of absolutism, which hopefully you understood in the previous video. Absolutism is when kings have complete and total power. The Enlightenment is a philosophical and thought-based time period that results from these absolute monarchs, where you have these great thinkers who are looking at absolute monarchs and saying, you are not protecting people's freedoms, you are not protecting people's rights, you should give up power, and that power should be given to the people. So take power away from rulers and give it to the people. That is what the Enlightenment is about. You live in a country that is entirely based on Enlightenment principles. Your Constitution is written off of the Enlightenment. This is why this is so important. When you get to civics and economics next year and you are studying the foundation of this government, of the United States of America, it is all of what these guys came up with put into action. Okay? So the father of the Enlightenment, kind of the Mac Daddy, is John Locke. None of these guys are American. They're all from European countries. John Locke was from England, and John Locke was alive during the English and Glorious Revolutions and saw what was happening with James Charles James, that general time period. And he came up with the concept of natural rights. And if you have a natural right means you are born with it and no one should be able to take it away from you. And he said your three rights are life, liberty, and property. Meaning you have the right to be alive, you have the right to be free, and you have the right to own things that people can't take from you. Thomas Jefferson totally copied this, because if you remember, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Certain unalienable rights are natural rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson changed property to the pursuit of happiness because he did not believe that all men deserve the right to own property, because he was a little bit of an elitist and a slave owner, but that's another story. Anyway, though, these are the three that you really, really have to remember. So John Locke, life, liberty, property. Okay, the only way these can be taken away from you is if you break the social contract. John Locke came up with the social contract, A guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, obviously French, expanded on the social contract, and he's the one that's more famous for it. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau basically said, look, the day that you're born, you make an agreement with the government that you were born into. It is a contract. You both sign a piece of paper, shake hands, make a deal. Here's the contract you have with the government. The government will protect your natural rights. The government will protect all of your rights as long as you follow the laws. So bottom line, you kind of have to give up some freedoms in order to be free. Think about this in the example that I have on the PowerPoint for you are like speeding. Okay. Well, you're probably wondering, oh, I have the freedom to drive a car. I should be able to drive as fast as I want. No, you can't, because by you speeding, you're compromising my right to life. Because if you go 95 miles an hour down Pfeiffer Road, you're going to kill someone. And the government doesn't care if you kill yourself. They care if you kill someone else. So we have speed limits because then you can be arrested if you're going too fast because then you are stopping my right to life. Does that make sense? Because if you hit me going 95 miles an hour and I die, I didn't do anything to take away my life. You did. So that's why then you can be put in jail for that. If you're going 95 miles an hour down Pfeiffer Road, that's not a speeding ticket. You're going to jail. And that's the idea of the social contract. So you have to give up certain freedoms so that everyone else can keep their rights too. That's the contract. But if the government stops protecting your rights, they're breaking their contract. They're breaking their end of the deal, and so we have the right to overthrow them. So it goes both ways. We have to follow rules so everyone else can have their rights, and we agree to that. But the government also has to hold up their end of the bargain and not infringe on our rights that they shouldn't be infringing on. And if they do, then we have the right to overthrow them because they're breaking their end of the contract. Charles Montesquieu came up with the concept of separation of powers, and this means that one person shouldn't be in power, absolutism, and he came up with the concept of branches of government. We copied this, and we copied the three that he came up with. He's the one that came up with judicial, executive, and legislative. Judicial are the courts, executive is the president, and legislative is Congress. And we copied this completely, and we use it today, and it works out well because one branch does not have total power. The executive branch can't do much without the legislative branch, and the judicial branch can squash anything that the executive branch and the legislative branch can do by declaring it unconstitutional, but the judicial branch cannot create laws. They can just deem things illegal, okay, or unconstitutional, rather. Voltaire is one of my favorites. That's not his real name, that's his pen name. Voltaire wrote about religious toleration, and what he said, because he grew up in a time period watching religious wars where governments were saying that we will follow this religion, and then people were fighting in wars to have the right to practice the religion that they wanted. So he was like, it's a huge waste of money for the government to try to enforce any kind of like religious belief on people. Let people practice what they want to believe. Like, as long as it's not hurting somebody else, like you can't, practice cannibalism as a religion, but as long as it's not hurting somebody else, let people practice what they want to practice. And we followed this in our First Amendment to our U.S. Constitution as the, there's no established religion in the United States. You can practice any religion you want to, or you can practice no religion at all, and it's not in the government's business. So basically, religion and government need to be separated. And this is a brilliant idea, and you want to live in a country where religion and government are separated. Trust me. Okay? And then lastly is Adam Smith. Adam Smith came up with a concept called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is French for literally translating to let the people do, and that means let the people do what they want. And we're talking about economics here, not talking about anything else. He's kind of like the father of capitalism, which is what we practice here in the United States. Capitalism is that things are not government owned, they're privately owned. So when your parents work for a business, that business is owned by a boss, like by a person. It's not owned by the government. Obviously, we have things that are owned by the government, but that's not the overwhelming majority. So Adam Smith is all about government keeping their hands out of the economy and letting people do what they want economic-wise. The joke that I always make for this is if you want to open up a hula skirt shop in Alaska, that's a terrible idea. You're not going to sell a lot of hula skirts in Alaska. But if you want to do that, then you should be free and, able to do it. Like, you can open that up. The government can't tell you that you can't do it. As long as you do things legally, you can do whatever business you want to do. Adam Smith would be woe against government bailouts of corporations, but as we are seeing, that's something that sometimes is necessary, especially in these times.